Hello, everyone. I'm Frank Sesno, director of George Washington University School of Media and Public Affairs. And in an era of social distancing, I'm thrilled to be joined by A'Lelia Bundles via Zoom. We're going to discuss Alelia's book, On Her Own Ground, The Life and Times of Madame C.J.Walker. It's a 4-part Netflix series starring Octavia Spencer. Maybe you've seen it. If you haven't, you should. Hi, A'Lelia.
Hey, Frank. Good to see you from a distance.
Yeah, from a distance. The show is called Self-Made, inspired by the life of Madame C.J. Walker. And A'Lelia, how long was this in production?
Well, the book was optioned about 3 years ago, but I really started, the very first time there was a Hollywood option was about 1982. So it's a really long journey.
Yeah, but your book published in 01, right?
In 01,
so
right.
This is a long journey for you too. How's that feel? This is your great-great-grandmother, right?
Right.
And your great-great-grandmother's story has now been read by many and seen probably by millions around the world.
Right. There's something about having something on a screen, a movie, on a TV series, on Netflix that really exponentially changes the platform. So yes, now millions of people who never heard Madame Walker's name know her name. So this has been pretty amazing for me after I have done many, many years of research and the facts and all of that to now see it on a screen where people all over the world are seeing it. I'm getting comments from people in Brazil. I mean, just who knew?
So you were a network news producer. You were a deputy bureau chief. You've written 4 books. You're working on a 5th, right?
Right.
Did you know that Madame C.J. Walker was a story, like a powerful story beyond just the biography from the moment you started learning about your great-great-grandma?
Well, really, for many years as a kid, it was just where my mother went to work every day. So, and my mother was really smart about not making it a big deal. But years later, when I really did to start to write about her, I knew the position, I began to understand the position she had held historically, but she was long forgotten. But there were little hints to me, little girls doing their Black History Month and Women's History Month reports on Madame Walker, beauticians for whom she was a patron saint. When we had a stamp in 1998, I got some sense of the importance that she held for others, but nothing like what we're experiencing now.
So there may still be some who don't know who Madame Walker was and what her product was. So give us the cliff note on that.
So Madame C.J. Walker was born Sarah Breedlove on the same plantation in Delta, Louisiana, where her parents and older siblings had been enslaved. She was born enslaved. Right. She was the first child in her family born free. So 1867, December of 1867. By the time she was 7, she was an orphan. She got married at 14, she said, to get a home of her own to escape the cruelty of her brother-in-law. And she had a daughter at 17 named Lelia. Then her first husband, Moses McWilliams, died when she was 20. She moved up the river to St. Louis, where her brothers had gone earlier, where they were barbers. She became a member of St. Paul AME Church and worked as a washerwoman, began to lose her hair. The women of the church really embraced her, and the more middle-class women began to give her a vision of herself as something other than an illiterate washerwoman. She began to make a hair care product, and by the time she died in 1919, she was 51 and living in a mansion in Irvington, New York, in Westchester County.
And not only living in a mansion, but at least if I'm to believe, and there are things I should believe and things, we'll talk about creative license in the Netflix thing in a minute. Did she really live next door to John D. Rockefeller?
Well, John D. Rockefeller's estate, Kike, it was about 3 miles up the Hudson River from where she was. But her mansion was facing the Hudson River, but they were not next door neighbors by any means.
There's a scene, though, where she and Rockefeller actually see one another.
Exactly.
Did that happen?
No.
No. All right, well.
That is total creative license, but we'll talk about that.
Yeah, we will, because I know that's been very much, in the news and in the reviews, and I'm very interested, and I think everybody would be very interested, in your take as an author, what role you had, and what you think, is true to the spirit of Madame C.J.
Right.
Walker and what's not. But before we get there, what do you think, from all you've known and studied and the amazing photographs that you've found, what's the most important thing about Madame C.J. Walker that you think people should know?
Well, I think one of the things that other people are interested in is, she was a millionaire. So I get that that's kind of a real interesting benchmark in America. But for me, what's most important is that she used that money to make a difference in her community as a philanthropist, as an educator, as a patron of the arts, and as someone who was very involved in the anti-lynching movement. So she empowered other women. She employed thousands of women, gave them jobs when Black women who had to work were working as washerwomen and sharecroppers and maids and laundresses and cooks. And she helped them become economically independent and in some ways create generational wealth for their families. One other thing that's important to me is just how that legacy played out through the years. She, at her 1917 convention, told the women in her keynote, I want you to understand that your first duty is to humanity. I want others to look at us and realize that we care not just about ourselves, but about others. And at the end of the convention, the women sent a telegram to President Woodrow Wilson urging him to support legislation to make lynching a federal crime.
Wow.
And that political, I'll just finish, that political involvement and spirit carried on really through the civil rights movement, where the beauticians helped pay for the buses to go to Washington for the March on Washington in 1963.
So her influence was incredible. That convention you're talking about, what was that? Was that a business convention? She pulled all her sales.
Right.
What was really revolutionary at the time in many ways to what she did was this sales force of people that she put together and encouraged them to talk about their own experience and all the rest, right?
Absolutely. 1917, Philadelphia, more than 200 African-American women came from all over the United States, the Caribbean, and Central America. It had to be one of the first conventions of women entrepreneurs. And this was a way, she was educating them, giving them tips on marketing, helping them do testimonials, talking about what they were doing in their communities. She gave prizes, not just to the women who sold the most products, but to those who contributed the most to charity. So she saw the power of organizing women for something, for business, but also for greater causes.
How a lot of people, I'm sure, who are watching our conversation here have seen all or some of the Netflix series. How do you think Octavia Spencer did in capturing your great-great-grandmother?
Yeah, I love what Octavia Spencer did. I thought she was the perfect person. I think she really embodied Madame Walker's courage and tenacity. And she gives, in the overall arc of the story, I think shows the sacrifices and the challenges of building your business. And
she wasn't the only candidate for that role, was she?
No, well, through the many, many years, there are a wide range of people who would have played it. There were many options. The book had been optioned many times. So there were other people along the way. Whoopi Goldberg early on, but that deal fell through. Esapatha Murkison was, a person who would have played the role. But there were many other people. But the universe took a long time for this the arc of the world universe is long. And it bent towards Octavia, but she was the perfect person for it. To have an Oscar winner in that role meant that people paid attention.
So let's play the fact or fiction game here for a minute, and then ask you how that resides with you. There was a lot of literary license, shall we say,
right,
in this series. What do you think was the most concerning to you?
Well, there are a lot of things. I mean, I will just say that there's so many people who worked really hard on this. I mean, the costume people, the designers, directors, people, and it was shot in Canada.
Oh, it's brilliant.
And there were people.
It's brilliantly done. I love the scene, for example, and then you have a picture of it, an old photo of your great-great-grandmother in this old car, a Model T, I don't know what.
Model T, right.
With 3 other women, very beautifully dressed, driving down the street, and it's spot on, it seems, in the series.
Right. There was great attention to detail to do that. But I do think that when this conversation about how something gets translated from the page to the screen, and we're journalists, we like facts, and even with creative license, it's for me trying to stick to the core of who the person is. And I think the head writer and the showrunners really had their own concept of the way they wanted to tell the story, which wasn't always the way I would have told the story.
So what about Addie?
So Addie is not a real character, and I think they went too far with that.
We need to tell people who haven't seen it who Addie was. Addie's the
So Addie is her rival, and in real life, Madame Walker absolutely had a rival named Annie. So the names are very close. So people draw the conclusion that maybe it's the same person. But in real life, this was Annie. Annie Malone became a very successful businesswoman. She was a big philanthropist. But Sarah Breedlove had worked as a sales agent for Annie Malone for about a year and a half or so. And then she branched out and started her own company. So that rivalry already started with accusations.
And the rivalry, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, then the rivalry as portrayed in Netflix is not merely a business rivalry, it's a colorism rivalry too.
Right. And that's just entirely in the imagination of the showrunners and the head writer. You know, there was a real rivalry between the two women. They were about the same complexion. I'll talk a little bit about why they did the colorism piece. And I thought that was, sufficient, that there was real competition between two women who had the same kind of business. But I didn't think that was the centerpiece of Madame Walker's life. And she wasn't walking around thinking about Annie Malone on a daily basis, which is the way it is portrayed in the film. But they wanted very much to get at this idea of colorism, of intra-racial, light skin, dark skin, who thinks who's better, who has more status. And so they incorporated that into this story and really made this about Annie Malone or Addie Monroe being a light-skinned mulatto woman who looked down upon a dark-skinned woman like Sarah.
What do you think is the value of something like that in a film like this?
Well, I think that colorism certainly is something that is still an issue in the African American community. It's an issue in Asia. It's an issue in Brazil. It's an issue anywhere where there are people who have a mix of races. But I think that it could have been introduced into the film in a different way not without it being the central part. Since it really didn't exist in the real relationship, I would not have made it the central part of their conflict.
How about the men and the role of the men in this series and in real life? Fascinating stuff.
So yeah, there were two things that were, in addition to the Addie Monroe, Annie Malone character, there were two other things that I really wanted to have in the series. One was a really close relationship, a close women friendship, because there were women who had mentored Sarah when she was still a poor washerwoman in St. Paul AME Church, a school teacher named Jessie Batts Robinson, and then later the manager of her factory, Alice Kelly, who had been dean of girls at a Black boarding school. For me, there could have been a composite character who would have really shown you a person that Sarah learned from and how she aspired to being like those more educated women. And they did not include that. The other thing that I wanted was to show the real strength of African-American businesses and organizations and leadership during that first generation out of slavery. F.B. Ransom, Madame Walker's attorney, would have fit that bill, but instead the decision was just to make him kind of an adjunct to Sarah. There were other men, the publisher of the Black newspaper and others, who I thought it would have been good to show that. And instead the decision was not to do that. And so there's I think a valid criticism that the men do not come off well. So
what was your role as the author of this book? I mean, we should put it on, I'm looking at my notes here. The name of the Netflix series is Self-Made, inspired by the life of Madame C.J. Walker. So how inspiring were you in all of this? And saying, no, you can't say that. That's not true. Or, wait a minute, guys, you've completely left out this huge part of my great-great-grandmother's life.
Right. Well, this is a lesson that I think everybody learns, like, who is negotiating your contract? And so I have learned a lot of things about this. A lot of things about this process. And inspired by is Hollywood speak for they can do whatever they want to do once they have optioned your book. And then you can negotiate, whatever you do. And what I had was not script approval, but I had script review. And so I thought I was going to be part of the, let's talk about how we're going to develop the series, but I was excluded from that part of the conversation. So that by the time I was able to review the scripts, everything really had already been approved by the studios. But I still gave notes.
And leaned on them. I know. And for anybody in our audience who doesn't know this already, Alilia and I, we have an opportunity to work together at the George Washington University School of Media and Public Affairs. Alilia is wonderfully on our national council, our advisory board, and she interacts with others and students and faculty and all the rest. And so Alilia, as we kind of wind down this conversation, two questions come to mind. One, as an incredibly successful African-American professional yourself, as you stood back, I guess, a little bit with a little bit of journalistic detachment that I know you've got as you did the work on your great-great-grandmother and saw this film come together and have thought about it so much since, how has all of this changed you?
I realize that how important it is that when you have an iconic historical figure, how really important it is, the message that is given to the audience. And I now have an opportunity to try to tell the truth, to keep doing what I've always done, which is to tell the facts about Madame Walker. And I've gotten people's attention through this. And even though it is an imperfect vessel in a sense, lots of people were inspired by that story, and it's making people think about increasing their side hustle and get their entrepreneurial skills together and realize that African Americans were starting businesses in the early 20th century. But it's changed me in this way that my instinct was telling me to speak up. And there were things that were preventing me from inserting myself into the process. And, now I have even less fear about doing that.
Glad to hear that. Go for it. Here's one of the remarkable things about this, as you said. People around the world are seeing this story now. People around America are seeing this story now. And through social isolation, they got more time on their hands. They're watching a lot of Netflix. What do you want audiences, and there are many, to take away from this story?
I hope that people are, in a general sense, inspired by Madame Walker's story, and that they, see the beautifully done movie, the sets, it's entertaining. But I also hope that they will understand that a Hollywood movie is not a documentary. You and I work in nonfiction and work in documentaries, and that it makes people want to dig more deeply. I mean, I write the books that I wish had been written for me, and our stories need to be told. And we need to help educate folks in Hollywood about why it matters if they change the story too much. And they need to try to understand and learn some more history. History needs to be taught better is maybe one of my bottom lines.
So let's end on this then. To the very specific audience, to the college student, or maybe the high school student, kids you know well, whether it's a young Black woman or a young Black man or a young white man or somebody from the suburbs or somebody from, they're going to come from all their different parts, but they're 20, 1917, 1918, that's forever ago.
Right.
What do you want them to take from this?
Well, Frank, I know how intentional you are about making sure that you have a diverse faculty, and that if there's not somebody on the faculty, there are advisors or mentors who can work with students. And I will say that my experience, the reason that I am here telling this story now is because of a professor. When I was at Columbia in journalism school and graduate school, I was writing my master's paper, and my master's advisor was Phyllis Garland, the only Black woman on the faculty, the first Black woman on the faculty at Columbia. And Phil and I talked about my master's paper, and how you have to come up with ideas. And I had really cliched, trite ideas. And at the end of the conversation, Phil said to me, "Your name is Alilia." My name is spelled A''Lelia. Your name is Alilia. Do you have any connection to Madame Walker and Alilia Walker? And I'm pretty sure that Phil knew the answer to that question. Her mother had been an editor at the Pittsburgh Courier. She had worked at Jet and Ebony. And I said, "Yeah, that's my family." And she said, "That's what you're going to write about." And that, if I'd had anybody else as a professor, they just would have thought, why does this woman have this weird name like this? And it was somebody who understood me and what my background might be, who then put me on this path that has turned into 4 books, almost 5, a Netflix series. And in addition to my career in network television news, where I learned all these storytelling skills, I've been able to apply them to a story that I think inspires people. So I just say that there's so much that happens when you are in college or when you are in graduate school. Somebody can see your spirit, can see a light shining, and can lift you and propel you. And so pay attention to your professors.
and to the books and the shows that are around you. Well, A'Lelia Bundles, it's just such a pleasure and privilege to have you associated with us. And this book, these books that you have written, these stories that you tell, and these shows that you inspire really make such a difference. And they do inform and they do inspire. So thank you so much. And, carry on, as they say, right? Thank you. Thank you.
And I look forward to being back at one of those lovely dinners at your home when we get through all of this.
Someday we won't social distance.
No time soon.
We might even be able to share a meal face to face. A'Lelia, thanks so much. It's been great.
Thank you.